In this video, we're going to talk about some strategies for differentiation, using reading comprehension as our focus, but with the understanding that these strategies can be applied outside of reading comprehension tasks as well. The first strategy is providing students with different ways to show what you know, to demonstrate their understanding of a passage. The second is reducing the language demand, or thinking about ways that you can make the language less complex or less challenging while still having students engage with the same cognitive task or the same content learning. So let's start with the first one, providing different ways to show what you know. So here you see a passage on the right-hand side of the screen that is taken from a text that's focused on first or second grade students, and it's focusing on the topic of different types of communities: rural, urban, and suburban. This was a topic that I taught when I was teaching second grade, so I know it's a topic that is often covered in elementary school. And I want you to take a moment now to read through the text. And as you're reading, I want you to think about 3 different ways that a student might demonstrate their understanding of this passage. So I'll give you a moment to read, and if you need a little bit more time, feel free to pause the video here before you move on to the next part. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next section, but again, feel free to pause your video if you'd like. So what are some ways that students can demonstrate their reading comprehension? And I'm taking these examples from Margot Gottlieb's book, Assessing English Language Learners, which is also the text that you read some chapters from this week. So one way that students can show what they understand is they can categorize, classify, or sort pictures, words, or phrases into groups. This is a great strategy for having students show you what they understood that also reduces the language demand, which is into our second differentiation strategy in terms of what you're asking students to produce. So students can be given pictures, for example, of different objects that would correspond to those 3 different types of communities. So they might have a picture of a farm, for example, for rural. They might have a picture of skyscrapers that go towards urban. So you're giving them different phrases, words, or pictures, and they're having to sort them to show you that they understood the passage. Another thing you can do is you can have students draw a picture based on the text. So rather than answering a question in writing, students can draw to show you what they know. They can match words with pictures, words, phrases, or sentences. So giving students some sample concepts from the passage and having them match them shows you that they understood those concepts. Underlying or highlighting main ideas or supporting details. So having them annotate the text to show you that they understand what the main idea is, what the main ideas are. Or supporting details are, and then completing cloze exercises using a word bank. So providing students with sentences or a paragraph that have words that are missing, and they have to fill those in based on their understanding. Sequencing pictures, sentences, or paragraphs. So in this context, sequencing might not be as useful since we're talking about kind of 3 different things that don't necessarily follow a sequential order, but if there was a passage that involved some sort of order, having students sequence shows that they understood that order. And finally, students can respond to oral comprehension questions with visual supports rather than having to simply provide answers in writing. So there's a lot of different ways students can show us what they know, what they understood from a text, that still allow us to evaluate their learning without requiring as much language that students are using to do that, or providing some additional scaffolds as students engage. So now we're going to move to the second item, and you can see that there's some overlap here, multiple ways to show what you know, but also reducing the language demand. But let's focus specifically on reducing the language demand. And so what I have here, the image on your screen is a list of questions that were connected to the passage that you just read. So this is a reading comprehension workshop. Worksheet, excuse me, and it has different questions. What is a rural area like? What is an urban area like? So these might be some comprehension questions you would want students to be able to answer. So look at this, and I want you to think about 2 ways you could reduce the language demand of this worksheet for students who are at different levels of English language development. All right, feel free to pause the video if you want more time to think, but we'll move on to some ideas now. One simple way to reduce the language demand is to add sentence starters. A rural area is, or a rural area has, and then students can complete the sentence. Or fill in the blank if you give them some additional words in a word bank. So giving them some of that initial sentence starter reduces the language that you're asking them to produce. And this goes into what I just said, goes into the second bullet, which is giving them a word bank of illustrated keywords. So such as many people, few people, city, countryside. And then as students are answering these questions, they have that word bank to draw from to be able to respond to and describe a rural area, a question around an urban area, etc. You could also reframe those first three questions into a graphic organizer. So rather than have them be listed separately, if you put them into an overlapping graphic organizer, they could answer the questions and also think about similarities and differences as they're doing that. So it also perhaps increases the cognitive challenge a little bit, but reduces what you might be asking them to do in terms of language, because maybe they can just write notes, they can do single words. So you're still having them think through their answer to the question, but reframing it using a graphic organizer as a tool. You can also have students work with a partner who shares their home language. That's a great strategy that I highly encourage teachers to consider as they're thinking about how they group students in the classroom, because being able to clarify a concept or a term with a peer is a great way to help students still be able to engage with the task at hand, but have that additional support. And as we mentioned with the first item, you can have students draw and label with characteristics, pictures of rural, urban, and suburban areas, rather than simply writing a sentence to describe or to answer each of these questions. And finally, if you're really focused on the content and not as much on the language itself, you could provide the student in the worksheet in the student's home language, and they could answer it in their home language. So a lot of it comes back to what extent do you really care about the mastery of the content, and to what extent do you really care that they are learning that content in English. So perhaps you could, obviously we want students to be also learning English, but if the focus really is what did they understand from this passage that they read in English, providing them with a chance to write about what they understood in Spanish or whatever their home language is a great way for you to get at that comprehension of a task that they were doing in their second language, in English. All right, so those are just some ideas to get you thinking about ways that you can both give students multiple ways to show what they know, and also reduce the language demand so that work that they're engaged, so that they can more easily access some of these different tasks that they're engaging with at school. And so I want to close with this reminder of something we've talked about at the very beginning of the course, which is that the content learning and cognitive tasks should still remain the same when we're differentiating, but the language used and the scaffolds can vary. And this is that image you saw in the first chapter of the Gibbons text. We want to aim towards that high challenge, high support space, right? We don't want students to be bored or anxious. We don't want them to be at a level where they're not being challenged. They should be challenged, but we should give them the supports they need to be able to engage with the content and the cognitive task that is at grade level. All right. And finally, the reminder that our students are not all the same, so our instruction and assessment shouldn't be either. And that is why differentiation is so important, and it really can make a huge impact in your classroom to make sure that you're meeting all of your students' needs.